Good morning, everyone. Thanks for tagging along. Today we're going to take a quick stroll up Crane Hill.
Well, the first phase of our journey is going to take us through this patch of scrubland on the edge of the village. It belongs to the local farm, but I've lived in the village about 10 years and they've never done anything with this sort of wasteland here. Well, meadow, let's not be negative about it. It's a very lovely meadow and they just let the grass run wild and it's about head height now. There's grasses, there's thistles, there's bulrushes. And in the winter it can look quite sparse and gothic. If you're not used to the countryside, as I'm not really. I only started walking about 10 years ago. Other than that, I was purely urban. So in a sense, I'm not acclimatized to being in places where there aren't people. And sometimes it can be quite spooky in the winter. You sort of head out into the woods and so forth, and it's can be eerie. And this field has the potential to feel a bit like that, but certainly not today. It's a Jekyll and Hyde difference in the summer. As you can see there, trees and hedgerows are absolutely fizzing with life right now. And I have no doubt there are foxes and deer somewhere in the tall grass back there at the edge of the field. Now, this year in particular, there's been an extraordinary number of butterflies. As when I first moved here about 10 years ago, I'd go walking in exactly these fields here and these hedgerows. And there wouldn't be much in the way of wildlife. You see the odd bee. And I think that could be because the hedgerows were trimmed back quite aggressively. I think nationally there is this awareness that in insect life, and pollinators in particular, were struggling. And there's a sort of growing enthusiasm for letting places like this run wild where possible. And butterflies seem to be benefiting. This year in particular, there have been cabbage whites and red admirals everywhere, which is great. And I do wonder, maybe it's partly due to climate change as well. I mean, I have noticed the climate changing over the past decade. And this summer, we're having a run of very hot days, of which this is one. Some of them topping 30 degrees. There's been a bunch, and according to the forecast, there's more coming. And that's unusual for England, or it used to be. Now it seems to be the way of it. I mean, we're still at the beginning of summer, really, and already the landscape is looking a bit parched, a bit sort of yellow, almost like southern Spain. But maybe the butterflies are going to be the beneficiary of that. Maybe they prefer that kind of temperature range. This is the big field that separates Gotherington and Bishop's Cleeve. You've got these two Gloucestershire villages, and if anybody wants to walk between them, they have to use the right of way that passes through this field. There isn't a proper path just yet. There's one being built the other side of that hedge, but it hasn't been finished yet. There'll be pavement and streetlights, but I'll probably stick to the field because I'm a bit of a stick in the mud, literally in that instance. And this is the Corpse Road that cuts through Gotherington. It's one of these little back alley routes that was used as a coffin route when people would die in the villages and hamlets around about. They would be carried in an almost ceremonial manner across the fields to the big churchyard in Bishop's Cleeve. And that's one of those ceremonial routes that's been preserved. At the other edge of Gotherington, this is the Shutters, a very nice gastro pub. And it would be absolutely terrific to finish every little walk with a Guinness in that pub, but I worry the accumulated cost of doing that every week would gradually add up. So I'm going to be frugal and not do it. This is Wallstone Lane, the little winding country lane that goes to the village of Wallstone. You can kind of see Wallstone. It's on that little hill right there. That's where we're going, Crane Hill. It's barely qualifies as a hill, but more of a lump. That's what we're going to do. We're going to climb to the top of that and then wander around to the village of Oxington, and then gradually wind our way back home. Well, there's two things going on with this particular walk. Firstly, I'm joined by one of my kids who I managed to persuade to come out with me. But they've decided to stay behind me and stay off camera, and I respect that decision. This is Tile Brook. There's a little brook that runs at the foot of Crane Hill, and it feeds into the river Swillgate, apparently, which in turn carries water to Tewkesbury. And that's theoretically what it should be doing, but it's so dry, it's dried down to a dribble. And there's another stream in the middle of the village that's just a gravel trench right now. It's completely dried up. And I do wonder if we're going to have drought conditions declared. Wouldn't surprise me. It's still the beginning of summer. Yeah, like I say, there are two things going on in this walk. One is my kid is being dragged along semi-reluctantly on this hike, and the other is road testing my boots. So I got some very expensive walking boots, and the lining has worn out at the back where my heel is. Last time I was out walking, it started to rub and it was painful, so I had to do a repair. And I did take them to the cobbler. We have a village cobbler who operates from a little square next to the church. And I consulted him. There was nothing he could do directly to fix up the lining of the boot. That's more of his kind of sewing job, I guess. But he recommended buying some adhesive patches from Amazon and augmenting that with some strips of Gorilla Tape, which I've done, so I've now got tape inside my boots. And it seems to be working out pretty well. I was in two minds about that. It was 2.5 years. I've had these boots 2.5 years, and now the lining's worn through. And on the one hand, that's not terrible. If you bought a cheap pair of boots and you chucked them out after 2.5 years, you'd feel okay about it. You'd got your money's worth. But these were some fairly high-end, well, these are some fairly high-end walking boots, and I want to get a little bit more mileage out of them than that. The last pair of boots I had was some Scarpas, some very traditional leather hiking boots. They lasted nearly a decade. But they weren't that comfortable, so I didn't go back to that model. But if you're going to pay top dollar for boots, you want them to last a bit longer than a couple of years. This is the top of the Crane Hill now. And as we're approaching that sort of field you can see on the left there, you can see there's a field that's been harvested. There was crops there last time I was up. But just as we were approaching there, you could see the tiny little red deer picking its way across the field. And I think it could see us coming. It just didn't seem that bothered. We were so far away, it couldn't be a threat. And onwards we go. A brief lunch stop. That's one of the things I have learned with walking is to deliberately stop. There have been occasions when I've walked for 15 or 20 miles, which for someone as fat and old as me is a fairly hefty walk. And when I set out with the ambition to walk that kind of distance, I tend to sort of knuckle down and just stride on and try and do it. And I'm not used to making myself stop and drink and calm down and rest. But ever since I started making myself do that, started making myself deliberately go slow, I find quite predictably that I accumulate far less injuries and arrive home far less tired than I would otherwise. Now I cut down through the woods towards Oxfordton. And I'm going to film the full path here, because I just like this path. So I just want to have a memento, something I can play back to myself when I'm at home, and walk through these woods virtually. I don't obsess about camping gear the way some folks do. Some people who have hiking channels they on YouTube, they film their walks, and sometimes if they're reaching for content and really can't think of anything much to post, they'll start doing gear reviews, which is tremendously useful, and I've certainly watched loads. Like most walkers, the quest for a the decent walking boot is like the search for the Holy Grail, something that is never accomplished. But it's just not how I roll particularly. I'm not a gear guy. When I first started walking, I was entirely dismissive of the idea of walking gear and paying big money for boots. I went out in jeans and sneakers initially, and very quickly became aware that that wasn't going to cut it, and there was a reason that hikers went out wearing lightweight, breathable, technical clothing and decent boots that were waterproof with decent tread. So I went camping a few times when I was a kid, and this was decades ago. And on school trips, I did a couple of trips to the Pyrenees, and one through the mountains in Turkey. And camping gear then was very heavyweight tents with comparatively heavy aluminium poles and steel pegs that were like a dumbbell. You know, a bag of steel pegs, tent pegs was a hell of a weight. And once I got back into hiking again, I discovered there was this new fad of super lightweight gear made of titanium and very specialist fabrics. The idea is to walk as light as possible, to fill your backpack with stuff that's absolutely as light as it can be. Which makes a lot of practical sense, but it's also that aspect of commodity fetishism that if you undertake a hobby, you tend to make a sort of start obsessing over stuff. And people reckon it's a facet of capitalism, I guess, that we've been taught to express ourselves and to seek enjoyment in the accumulation of stuff above all else. And you can see that happening with a bunch of different hobbies. Like I got into running at one stage. I lost a lot of weight some years ago and decided to run a charity 10K. And if you buy running magazines, it's very apparent that the entire sport, magazines, events, is entirely supported by footwear sponsorship. It's just wall-to-wall trainer ads. Which is okay, it keeps it going, but interestingly, there are arguments about foot health, that super soft trainers aren't necessarily the best thing, and that there's a sort of clique of people, running people, who think running in bare feet is actually the most beneficial and natural way you can run. But as you can imagine, if an entire sport is supported by trainer sponsorship, then the idea that you should do without stuff becomes almost heretical. It's the one sort of idea you can put forward that'll be absolutely guaranteed to be spurned. And hiking's a bit like that. If you buy country magazines or support any kind of organisation, it's always the peripheral advertising. The accumulation of stuff. In the case of walking, it's backpacks and obviously walking shoes. Sometimes hiking meals. This is a lovely field, I've enjoyed this. It's on the side of Oxeton Hill and it bends back towards home. So this is kind of the return journey. And I've walked through it about 2 or 3 times lately, as each time the crop's grown higher. And as you can see, it's right at the stage where it's going to be harvested any second now. So I'm kind of enjoying it where I can. So I know sooner or later I'm going to go back and it's going to be just stubble. That's okay, I'll be able to enjoy the wheat as breakfast cereal. So I guess we're wandering home now. I hope you don't mind me babbling about gear too much. It's one of the things going on walks like this. If you're walking beside me, if you were actually joining me on these hikes, we would talk absolute nonsense, both of us sort of free associating, getting stuff off our chest. In my case, it tends to be fairly lightweight nonsense, but At any rate, my boots have holed up. My feet are feeling a lot less sore. That's definitely a win.
Well, I'm heading home now. Thanks for tagging along. I'll see you soon.